Okay, thank you. Now we continue with Luiz Recamán, who is a professor at the Department of History of Architecture and Design Aesthetics at FAU USP. He graduated from FAU USP and obtained a master and PhD degrees in aesthetics at the School of Philosophy and Human Sciences at the USP. His main research deals with architecture aesthetics, architecture criticism, Brazilian modern architecture, and the relationship between the social housing and urban development. And he's the author of Brazil's Modern Architecture from 2004. By that, I'll hand the floor over to you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you all. Well, I'm going to read. Sorry for that. I'd like to thank everybody that's here today. I will present a quick script of my research, highlighting some elements that I consider fundamental to understand the current stalemate of the spatial imagination. It's here. It's here.
It's missing.
Okay. Yes.
Just use the arrows, but now it'll work.
The main question proposed here is to think the urban according to the spatial strategies historically linked to the creation of œuvre, the city, the public, the capital city, the private, liberalism, the social democracy, the market, neoliberalism, and the common, the city. It's a schematic periodization that seeks to understand the connection between urban form and content in order to clarify the spatial elements at play in the equation of ideological crisis in neoliberalism. The first point to highlight is the contradiction between the reinvigorated commercial cities at the end of feudalism and the emergence of nation-states from the Renaissance. Lefebvre says that the archaic city in the West arises under the imprint of separation, city and countryside, material and intellectual labor, the natural and the spiritual, the common and subjective, physis and logos. In the archaic city, the philosophy is born by the division of labor and aims for the totality, negating what has been separated, quoting, riches of the territory, the scattered activities and the people, the word and writings, end of quoting. The city unifies urban form and its content according to rationality of logos. This consciousness reappears in the Renaissance. Old urban centers resurface strongly, creating a network of cities interconnected by trade and cultural routes. However, as Lefebvre recalls, this urban system did not come to fruition. In these important commercial cities, the architecture was oriented to the construction of œuvres, works, in the city, commissioned by rich merchants. There was a great identification between the city and society, even considering the social conflicts between the poor and the rich. Very oppressive societies were very creative and very rich in œuvres. The geometry of perspective opened clearings in the medieval city, indicating the conjunction of artistic reason and economic reason. The map of Europe was redrawn according to a system of important independent cities, interconnected by increasingly complex and global trade routes. This urban and division of labor system, however, was never achieved, at least in the sense of a network of autonomous city-states. At this moment, a structuring institution is emerging, the state, and the seat that represents it, the capital city. Lefebvre notes that the medieval double hierarchy of feudal land and guilds become a triple hierarchy with the emergence of states apparatus of absolutism. The state supersedes the relative independence of commercial cities and their regions of influence, becoming a new centralizing logic of political and economic life. Despite the great expansion of cities, philosophical rationalism will now sometimes turn to the state and other times to individual. With Hegel in modern society, the state subsumes the city, which becomes a subsystem among others. The rational and the real converge historically, and this junction no longer happens in the city, but in the state. As the city and its representations are no longer the center of the political life, new power schemes begin to cross the urban reality. The space of capital cities are designed according to the logic of the state and its power, the king and the court. The sense of identity is mediated by configuration of the public, now identified with the state as unifying instance of the social. The century of enlightenment will witness the moment of crisis of traditional schemes and the emergence of new social representations about the relationships between individual and society. This polarity will greatly influence the ideological prefigurations of modernity. Architecture and urbanism fulfilled a fundamental ideological task, shaping the social. Meanwhile, liberalism elaborated its emphasis on the individual and free action in the market. The 18th century will also watch the formal laws of order, as Tafuri says, that guaranteed unity between exceptional objects and the whole of the city. New demands are presented to it, geometric systematizations, typologies, constructive rationalities, and most importantly, shaping the social, Tafuri, and the public, Starobinsky. The representations of the urban at the beginning of liberalism tend to split between a unitary totality, which progressively conflicts with the growing disorder of an industrial city, and a heteroclitic whole that acquires its virtue in the free realization of fragments of space. As the urban form fragments and spans, urbanism and architecture have the task of unifying space and giving it a broad social sense. The liberal seat will soon announce its limits. Individualized action, at least as far as city space is concerned, has not achieved collective virtues. At the opposite pole of liberal beliefs, major urban reforms were carried out by centralizing states, which tore apart the traditional urban fabric by imposing new typologies of the new centers of consumption. Liberal entropy reached its peak between the World War I and World War II. In this context, the desires for order repressed by liberal ideologies are exacerbated. Tafuri considers the bold urban and architectural projects of the late 20s as the ideology of planning. The productive and social disorganization of liberal capitalism was reaching its limits. In this sense, prefigurations of programmed rationality were built primarily by radical architecture. This contradiction between rational factory order and social disorder in the city was confronted preferentially by social democracy. The consolidation of German industry was well-articulated state strategy to overcome structural shortcomings of its late modernization. During the Weimar Republic, architects participate intensively in public administration. Several housing states, Siedlungen, were quickly built through the development of the industrialization of building construction. These settlements were, according to Tafuri, oases of order and spatial and social rationality. This contradiction reproduces the contradiction of social democracy, which is responsible for managing the social imbalance generated by an unchanged productive process. The economic planning that characterizes the hegemonic social state in Europe after World War II also resorted to the massive production of collective housing for works. However, large housing estates built after 1945 created worker ghettos through their homogeneous and regularity extensibility associated with a simplifying functionality of everyday life. In this period, Fordism was in fact implemented in industry, leaving behind its mass utopias. Translated into mass housing, highways and zoning, modern architecture and urbanism come to support the expansion of capitalism across the globe. Taking into account this bound that originates from modern architecture is fundamental to understand the present moment. The changes in the whole of states after the 1980s are largely explanatory of what followed the collapse of architectural modernization, represented lato sensu by the postmodernism. This was not a remission of state power subject to the dominance of private and financial logic, but the new role of the state as a strategist for big business through a financial and competitive logic to which it submits itself. The state promotes accumulation in its specific domain, the commodified urban space. Big events and strategic urban operation must then be analyzed by the logic of states that now enter into business management that escaped the logic of strict private property, the public dimension of the cities, collective spaces and urban structure, and social dimension of the city, housing supply for workers. The strategic planning and commodification of urban and social promoted by neoliberalism was only possible due to the totalizing social genetics of modern architecture, especially its apex in the late 20s. Since the 70s, strategies of urban spectacularization and commodification have associated national states with financial capitalism, alienating the representation of the social world and the weakening of society. In the critical debate following the 2008 crisis and the intensified anti-globalization movements, we see the term common increasingly emerging, especially in the environmental struggle. In this field of disputes, the advance of contemporary capitalism over the traditionally considered common goods, the need to delimit a domain that cannot be commodified and which simply does not correspond to the public propelled the old idea of common goods. Laval and Dardot included in their current meanings of tangible and intangible commons, such as knowledge and culture, the construction of a new revolutionary subjectivity through a common praxis. In this sense, the common action carried out by these movements establishes a new social possibility that would be outside both the logic of the market and the logic of the state. In conclusion, we can indicate the need in terms of architecture and urbanism to evaluate this anti-state strategy for two reasons mainly. The first, the community-wide constraints of action and understanding, considering the various scales implied in social reality. Harvey considers it necessary to have some kind of state structure to mediate intergroup practices. The clarity between the state and market domains is not of the same intensity globally. Second, at the periphery of the system, the state did not conform to its original meaning, even less if we consider the social state in the second post-war period. Its role was fundamental to the construction of a modern society, albeit in contradiction. This observation may be useful for thinking about the relationship of architecture and urbanism with the praxis of the common. The new disciplinary condition brought other logics and instruments of action different from those inherent in the elaboration of art and architecture objects. These new instruments were originally tied to the state and its logic of comprehensive productive rationality, in the sense of the machine civilization. Captured by the accumulative strategies of neoliberalism, the strategies of architecture and urbanism seek to reconstruct their links with their social dimension. It's important to know if this reconstruction involves the resumption of the state in its modern and social vocation, or the reconfiguration of this field of knowledge diluted in the multiple appropriation of everyday life. And so, is it possible to think of the production of a space without conceived space or rational space? That's it. Thank you.